Hey, Aaron, thanks for joining. We have your slides, and so that should be good. I don't know if we get Philip as well to have a second presentation.
I thought this was the only one on the agenda for today.
Okay, so then we should have updated the agenda. So remove his presentation.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Hey, Mike.
Hi, guys. Hannes,
Yeah,
thanks for looking at the Jose situation over the weekend.
no problem.
I'm going to reply
My
to
point.
T trying to schedule a call.
Yeah.
How are you, Aaron? Did you have good holidays?
Yes, I did. Thanks.
Yeah, by the way, Happy New Year to everyone. So we are
Yeah.
starting fresh into the new year with an OAUTH working group call, so that's fantastic. So so we have more participants now, that's a good sign. Everyone is eager to get some work done. Let's give folks a few more minutes and then we get started. I hope Rifat is going to join. He has some audio issues.
Looks like a couple of folks are having trouble getting logged in.
Yeah, that can happen.
Meet Echo seems to have a hangover from the new year still. It was a little slow this morning.
Yeah, Rifat tells me that he still has some problems joining, so how should we best do that? I can obviously share the slides myself, but I can't take meeting minutes at the same time, I fear. That's going to be an issue. Well, but I fear we have to start. Well, in any case, can you see my slides, the chair slides?
I
Yep.
can.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, you're all aware that we decided to schedule a couple of interim meetings in between the two IETF meetings. So this is one of the series, one out of that series. You also know the note well, which means that you should have read at some point in time these references, these BCPs, which govern the process. In fact, actually, for newcomers, we have repeatedly done some extra sessions on how the IETF process works because it can be complicated at times. So take a few minutes and have a look at those. Obviously, lots of experienced people on the call as well, so I don't need to repeat that. So this is the list of interim meetings. So we had already done the SD chart VC. We talked about the transaction tokens and identity chaining. The client ID scheme is next. We have the scheduled presentations for the token status lists, which we, as the yellow marking indicates, have a working group last call ongoing. We have the one-time token and the private key chart issue as Rifat described it in this slide deck. So there are more calls to come, and we also need to schedule or make a proposal for the upcoming IETF meetings on how many sessions we are going to schedule, which we are going to discuss with our AD, Deb, who is also on the call, in case you haven't seen it. So there would be more coming. And we have a few documents Refat and I are sort of processing and getting out of the working group into the hands of the ISG. So that's, I think, pretty good progress. Okay. Let me switch over to the actual real meat. Or is there any agenda bashing or any other item that anyone wants to raise? Anything you guys? If not, then I'll switch over to the OAuth client ID scheme. Is that, Aaron, do you want to drive it or should I do it?
Yeah, I can take slide control if you can approve me.
Okay. Did that
Great.
work?
It did.
Okay. I will try to type some notes in the meanwhile, but if anyone is able to help me with note taking, that would be fantastic. We try to only capture the essence, not it's not a transcript, as you all know, but we want to make sure that we capture the action items out of this, so we don't forget in 2 weeks.
Great.
Go for it.
Okay, thanks. So this is to set some context. This is a follow-up to a session that we had at IETF 121, talking about the client ID metadata document draft that I put together. The summary of that draft is essentially there is a way for OAuth clients to publish their metadata, which uses the dynamic client registration vocabulary at a URL, and then using that URL in the authorization request. So this mirrors a lot of the other metadata documents of other roles like the authorization server and the resource server. So this is now just applying it to clients. So in the when it's used in the authorization request, the client ID is the URL of the document. The document has to confirm that it is, in fact, that URL, which is very similar to the way protected resource metadata works. And for some context of why you might want to do this, this is useful when pre-registration of clients is not possible. So in a lot of OAuth deployments and OpenID deployments, pre-registration of clients is assumed that that is how things work. But in many situations, it is actually not possible to do that when apps are connecting to, for example, self-hosted servers where there isn't a way to pre-register those client IDs. So the discussion at IETF 121, a lot of the comments actually ended up being about the use of the URL as a client ID rather than about the metadata document itself. And in particular, how the use of the URLs as client IDs has been done in several other ways and other types of URLs in various ecosystems. The core of the problem that was focused on at the meeting was that there is several overlapping uses of, in particular, HTTPS URLs. There's a lot of other types of URLs that are used in OpenID for VP, for example, which it actually defines its own list of different client ID schemes. But there are a couple of different uses of HTTPS URLs. For example, there's one where the redirect URL is used as the client ID. OpenID Federation uses HTTPS URLs for client metadata. And then this draft that I had brought also uses that. So essentially what I realized is these are two separate issues. There's one issue is the concept of hosting the client metadata at a document, at a URL. And a separate issue is the use of that URL as a client ID. This mainly is a problem when the authorization server wants to support multiple different methods of multiple different ways of handling OAuth clients, and it doesn't, and there's ambiguity in what the interpretation of a client ID could mean. This has been discussed in OpenID for VP a fair bit. So there's some notes there, and there are a not insignificant number of deployments that already use HTTPS URLs as client IDs. So this draft is essentially taking this part of the OpenID for VP spec, which introduces a namespace for client IDs, and pulling that out into its own draft. So this is a summary of what the OpenID spec contains. Essentially, it defines a namespace for client IDs, and it defines several of the schemes. So the client IDs become a string, a colon, and another string. The scheme being some of them are defined in this document, redirect URI, DIDs, verifier attestation, and it also defines HTTPS, but the OpenID spec specifically defines the HTTPS scheme just for use by OpenID Federation. And then it also, of course, supports or allows for fallbacks to pre-registered clients when there is no colon in the client ID. Also worth noting that this is not meant to be an actual URL. Like this is not a URI. This is just a scheme, a colon, and then a value. So this new draft, the client ID scheme draft, essentially does just this. It pulls the client ID scheme into its own draft. It defines the few that are defined in OpenID for VP. It also defines the HTTPS scheme for ecosystems that only need to use the one scheme, which then could be either OpenID Federation or client ID metadata documents. This sentence down here, if you are using HTTPS client ID schemes, we want to make sure we avoid this ambiguity or the multiple different conflicting ways to resolve metadata, because it is a problem if an OAuth server doesn't know which method to use to fetch the client metadata, whether that's OpenID Federation's vocabulary or the client metadata document vocabulary, or just using it as a redirect URL. So the recommendation would be, if you are expecting conflicting uses of HTTPS URLs, then you have to prefix them or use a different issuer for each of the different conflicting methods. And then the plan would be to update the OpenID for VP spec and update the client metadata document draft to reference this client ID scheme. Basically, so it pulls out that aspect of the client metadata document draft, which so that draft is really just about the metadata document itself and not about using it as a client ID in an authorization request. So this is the one proposal for avoiding this conflicting interpretation of HTTPS as client IDs, basically by saying, if you do need to support multiple different ways, for example, OpenID Federation and the client ID metadata document, then you could do that by just using two entirely different issuer values, which have different paths for the different authorization endpoints and different token endpoints. That way there's no conflict, because clients would only be using the one that would sort of tell it which one, how to interpret that string anyway. But this is, of course, only necessary if you expect that you want to support multiple ways of handling HTTPS URLs, and in many cases that just won't be needed. And there are situations that would only ever support one of the two different methods, and they wouldn't need to do anything special, because then there's no ambiguity. So that is the very quick summary of the draft. The last slide is just the link to the draft. Any questions on that and any other comments? And I see Daniel Fett just managed to join. He was having trouble getting on earlier. Great. He's here, and Joseph is here as well, another one of the co-authors of this.
Aaron, on the wording, so you are essentially proposing to put an HTTPS URL into the client, or use that as a client ID.
Correct.
You're not proposing to define a new client ID scheme, a URI scheme, or URL scheme, or URN scheme.
So this draft defines a syntax for client IDs, and the syntax defined is a client ID scheme, a colon, and then the value. So when that is something like a did URL, the scheme becomes DID, and the value is the rest of it, which matches did URI strings. When that is an HTTPS URL, the scheme becomes HTTPS, and the value becomes the / hostname and path. But yes, the end result is that it is a HTTPS URL used as a client ID for the HTTPS scheme, while also supporting these alternate schemes or for client ID values.
Yeah. Yeah, that may be a wording that could confuse, because I think you're not suggesting, you definitely want to have a locator in there which you can use to then look up metadata. You don't want to have something like, let's say, a URN, which is not a locator, which would be something entirely different, right? And you're not proposing that.
Correct. This is, I mean, somebody could use a URN if they also define how to resolve that into client metadata. But this draft defines, in particular, ones that include a way to retrieve that metadata.
Okay. I see Emilia, you on the queue?
Yeah, why not? This seems like it implies that either the authorization server or the client, potentially both, would be parsing the client ID, which is meant to be an opaque value, according to the OAuth spec. Would it not be better to introduce a client ID type parameter? And if it is not present, then have that be whatever the server chooses. If it is present, then it's one of n registered schemes. Wouldn't that be simpler than parsing?
It sounds simpler, except that so this actually was the path that the OpenID spec went down originally, and they did define essentially that a client ID type. I don't remember what it was called exactly, but it was essentially a separate parameter. And the problem is that it looks good for the authorization request part, which is just this, using it as in the URL. But once you start needing to reference the client ID value in other parts of the OAuth ecosystem, for example, putting it into a JOT because you need the audience claim for a JOT or other things like that, you essentially end up having to now put both of those values into the JOT, which then now you are also defining new JOT claims, and the behavior when that additional parameter is not understood then introduces new issues of ambiguities of, well, if you're only looking at the string, the client ID value, and you might be misinterpreting it then because you weren't even aware of the new parameter type. So doing this all in one value, yes, it does require that the authorization server understands how to parse that client ID, but it simplifies a lot of the stuff down the road for that.
Right.
Oh, and Daniel is linking to the GitHub issue where this was discussed in OpenID for VP.
But if I send a authorization server a client ID with did example 1234, and it only understands HTTPS schemed client IDs, it's not going to know how to resolve that did.
Correct, and that's fine. And that's actually better. But that's better than passing, for example, did an example 1234. If it only had passed example 1234, that could be misinterpreted as other types of other schemes, depending on the value there.
Right, but it would still be a URI. Because a did
Right, so-
did value is a URI of types.
Right. So the
I
point
recall
is,
correctly.
if you remove the scheme from the client ID value itself, then the rest, the value, becomes ambiguous and might be interpreted by the authorization server as the wrong thing, leading to actually bad results, as opposed to an error right here, which is where you want it to stop. If a client passes in a did value to an AS that only supports your HTTPS URLs, you want it to error out immediately. You don't want it to misinterpret that.
Right, but it would error out immediately anyway because it wouldn't find anything. It wouldn't know how to handle what that URI is.
Well, it depends on the value of the URL. So like, and I think there's some details on this on the GitHub thread, because it depends on which scheme you're talking about. When a value of a scheme is a valid value for a different scheme, that's where it becomes a problem.
Okay.
Do check out that link in the chat for the background on that issue, though.
Aaron, do you expect some problems with some existing deployments where there was no specific structure assumed?
No, because this is meant to address the existing deployments that do assume a structure. For example, OpenID Federation and other ones that are based on the client ID metadata. So like this is already happening where, OpenID Federation defines HTTPS URLs for client IDs and client metadata documents, and there's a few things built on that use HTTPS URLs as client IDs. So they are already doing that. Do I expect that every authorization server is going to suddenly support client ID schemes? Absolutely not. And I think it's, like I said in the applicability slide, it's really meant for just the case where the pre-registration of clients is not possible in the ecosystem. I do not expect that ASs that support only pre-registered clients would ever adopt this. That's not the intent. So there isn't really a conflict there.
Guys, you can also ask Aaron on live, so to speak, but via audio. You don't need to type into the chat.
Yeah. So there's two different things going on here. One is this discussion of client ID schemes happened in the OpenID for VP spec, and that's where the discussion of, oh, should it be a separate value? Should it not? That all happened, and then the result of that discussion was, let's use a single string for the client ID, so we're not adding a type, which avoids a lot of the ambiguity and a lot of the other implications down the road. That's where we get the scheme : value. And then there's an additional issue, which is if you have two different uses of the same scheme. For example, HTTPS, which is used by OpenID Federation, and also the client ID, client metadata document. So that's where this problem sort of comes back is, well, if we have two different ways to resolve metadata when the scheme is HTTPS, is this actually a problem?
Brian is on the queue.
I got dropped out there for a minute, technical issues, but I think I'm back. I get why, I understand why they're being placed in the same parameter value. That makes sense. And even the idea of sort of defaulting to a single type of scheme in cases where there's no ambiguity on the authorization server side makes sense. And although there may need to be some facilities for a client to understand what is supported or what the default would be, because you talked a lot about the authorization server deciding like when there's ambiguity or not and what can be sent, but that's not at the beginning of a flow. That's not up to the authorization server. It's the client that needs to know that. So there must be some way, if a client that might be able to do federation and regular old-fashioned, whatever you call it, HTTPS resolution of metadata, needs to know what to send to the authorization server. It's in the order of events. It's not the authorization server's decision. I mean, it is, but the client needs to know before sending it some sort of facility. I'm talking in circles.
No, so that was, yeah, absolutely, and that was meant to be addressed by this this proposal of essentially using separate issuer URLs, which means there are separate authorization URLs, so that the client would use the one that it knows. Like if it's going to do a federation to this server, it's going to use the federation's issuer URL, and if it's going to do the client ID and metadata document, it's going to use the other URL. And then there's we avoid the ambiguity again.
Okay, that makes me extremely uncomfortable.
How so? I suspect that there are very few situations where you would actually have an authorization server supporting both of these different documents types at the same server, because they are very different ecosystem deployment architectures.
That makes some sense the way you describe it, but if you think about like a generalized authorization server type product or service that might very well want to either be configurable or support simultaneously both sort of resolution methods, I don't think that's necessarily a fair assumption.
Yeah, and that's why I went down this path of if you are trying to productize it and make it support all of the different things, then as long as the one issuer and its authorization server metadata only supports one method, then it's fine again, right?
Well,
like there's
fine,
nothing
as
stopping
long as you then have like a virtual issuer to describe the entire other authorization server deployment.
Yeah. But that exists in several products already. So there's no like.
Yeah, and it's terrible. Like at least in maintaining it and trying to explain it to people, like what that looks like, and
I have not found it to be terrible. But
what if you want to say use the same authorization server, like a top level domain as your issuer URL? And
yeah, that becomes not possible to support.
So that seems kind of.
But I don't think it's a realistic want. I think that in the cases of, first of all, I think it's an edge case at all that you're going to have a product supporting both. And in the case that you do, I think that that's already a sufficiently complex enough product that it would start to be doing these things of having multiple issuer URLs under its top level domain anyway. So.
Could you, for the minutes, describe what you believe is not possible with that design?
If your OAuth issuer URL is a top level domain, like just authorizationserver.com, that means, and if you really are like firmly set on having that being the only issuer URL for this server, you get one OAuth server metadata document based on that URL. And that's where you're not able to then distinguish between these two different uses of HTTPS URL metadata resolution for the client metadata.
Are you describing this in the document as well?
Yes, it's somewhere in there. It can probably use some clarifications and more context, but it's sort of in there.
while I go through the list, Emilia.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the use case was to have a unique client ID in subsequent stages of OAuth protocols. So, for instance, in the JOT, having these separate authorization endpoints, I don't think would achieve that. Nor would having the client IDs both be these HTTPS URIs.
It does
Would it-
solve it because anytime these client IDs are used later, they're also joined with the issuer URL. So the JOTs would contain an issuer and client ID, and that creates the pair.
Wouldn't your issuer in this case be the same thing?
No, that's what I'm saying.
Because
In
it's
this
the same
example,
authorization server?
so in this example, you would have, I should have put it on the slide to make it more explicit, but in this example, you would have two different issuer URLs. So they effectively appear as two entirely separate OAuth servers. And the two different issuer URLs, one issuer URL would be for each method of metadata resolution.
I'm just thinking that based on reading through a very brief read through the syntax here, wouldn't it be better to have the full https example.com URI there as the client ID, but prefix it with something like metadata : or federation : whatever, and then you're looking for that rather than parsing the URL itself, and the URL remains as an opaque value.
That is another option that we discussed. This use of HTTPS as the client ID scheme is admittedly a little bit of a hack, but the intent is to support the many deployments that currently do this, which is just the client ID is a plain URL.
Yeah, so
I don't want to get in a situation of being like, hey, everyone who's implemented OpenID Federation and the client metadata document, go and add this prefix to your client ID because somebody somewhere might have a problem with it later that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, so I'm suggesting that this would only be a spec that is necessary if you implement two conflicting HTTPS schemes.
That is
then you would use the metadata : to differentiate between the two different client IDs, which are potentially having different scopes, different permissions, whatever.
You can definitely do that. The implication there is that the client has to know that that this authorization server has this need to distinguish.
And we have authorization server metadata to advertise that.
Yeah, we do. We could go that route. Yeah.
E.g., client ID. You would have some sort of parameter that is like client ID separation required or something. Making up a word here.
Some parameter like that, and then essentially that changes this list. It would say we're defining these schemes that are not ambiguous. We're defining HTTPS for when you only need one, and if you need two different HTTPS schemes, then you have to define a prefix like a different scheme and use the whole HTTPS URL as the value in this syntax. That it would absolutely work. It would be an alternative to this recommendation of using the separate issuers, and it might maybe that's a cleaner way to do it.
I think that would give clearer separation between client IDs, passing them down the chain, because then you would actually have that prefix continued down. And any intermediary software doesn't have to guess, does Authorization Federation use the Federation HTTPS scheme, or does it use client ID, client metadata HTTPS scheme? It would just
I agree, and I feel like
that string again.
I feel like that addresses Brian's comment as well of this being kind of an awkward solution.
So then you would probably have, I guess, two parameters additional in authorization server metadata. One, which is the default scheme, i.e., if you pass a client ID and it matches this, then the default is this method. Otherwise, you have to indicate it or something. And here's a list of supported method types.
Mm-hmm.
Also thinking for the case where there is some HTTPS scheme that we've not thought about yet, and it later becomes an extension of something.
Yep.
Good. Next one in the queue, Joseph.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the last discussion already covered some of what I was going to say, but I think essentially what we're dancing around here is, if we were designing this from scratch, how would we ideally do it? Whilst also saying, how are we going to cope with the two major existing use cases that are already live and using HTTPS URLs? So the kind of direction we're going in is that it's pretty clear that if you were designing this from scratch, then having something like this prefix or one of the other ways is the way to actually clearly distinguish these things. And we need to finesse the language, because I think what we should essentially be saying is that nobody going forward should use bare HTTPS URLs apart from the people that have these two existing ecosystems deployed that already use them. And then it's just the case of what language we put in to try and cope with some of these ecosystems. And yeah, I think there's a question of how strong we are with some of this wording, like the OpenID for VP spec and the Federation spec and the spec Aaron's talking about, the client metadata from HTTPS one. They're all not final yet, so we've got quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what we do, apart from this desire to not break the existing ecosystems. So yeah, I mean, I think we should assume that going forwards, we only have those two ecosystems that are a problem, and nobody else should be using bare HTTPS URLs, basically, so we can avoid the ambiguity. And the other thing is that, yeah, we could do something with client metadata, but unfortunately, in some other situations where OpenID for VP is used, you can't get. So I think I said client metadata there, and when I meant server metadata, there are some situations where OpenID for VP is used where you can't get server metadata, or you don't actually know which server, actually a wallet, the request is going to until you get the response. So I try and avoid us going down the paths that rely on metadata, particularly because they're just introducing extra complexity that's actually only to solve these two kind of cases that I know people aren't going to like me calling them legacy, but they're kind of existing deployed ecosystems that we just want to keep working and have a different way for other people to use HTTPS URLs in the future.
Mike?
Yes. Like Joseph, some of what I was going to say has been covered, but I'll try to make some summary statements. For one thing, in the OpenID DCP working group, there were months of discussion about this topic. And we used to not solve it. And then we used to have a second parameter called client ID scheme. And Daniel Fett, among others, pointed out that there were security issues associated with having the two different values, which could be mixed and matched by attackers. And so we pulled that out and went to having a client ID scheme prefix. That said, because there's a number of Federation deployments, including in the wallet space, for instance, every finalist in the German wallet competition supports OpenID Federation, not because they had to, but because they thought it made sense. So there's going to be a lot of deployments across multiple kinds of ecosystems that use Federation for trust establishment. And because it's been using HTTPS in this way for years, we decided not to break it. At the beginning of your presentation, Aaron, it seemed like you were going down the path of just copying what OpenID for VP decided to do. I think that would make a world of sense because we wouldn't bifurcate things. And I wanted to support Brian's point that there are going to be pieces of server software and client software where they can be used in lots of contexts, and sometimes a feature will be used and sometimes they won't. You know, I'm sure that Okta has such software. I know that Authleet has such software, et cetera. And so we should be catering to that. So I think the sane path, even if somewhat inelegant, is to copy what OpenID for VP is doing. Thank you.
Brian.
Sorry, I was trying to type in the chat too. It's hard to, I don't know, it's hard to follow which conversation is which here. I think, well, I don't know. Maybe we're dancing around it. Maybe it just comes to my view, but I find it extremely awkward that there's the use of this something : something else that we're calling a scheme, and I'm actually well aware that the name scheme was my ID back in the DCP working group, or back when it was Connect or whatever, wherever it was. But it's super odd that it's sometimes kind of a URI with a legit URI scheme and sometimes not, prefixed with something else. And I understand there's people that want to keep compatibility with existing deployments, legacy, whatever you want to call them, by not prefixing HTTPS. But I really think we would be better off with a legitimate prefix separator thing, whatever that is, and probably something different than what looks an awful lot like a URI scheme. And if we really need to account for these pre-existing deployments of federation, or whatever we're calling this, sorry, Aaron, I don't know the name, of HTTPS style metadata resolution, maybe some rules or explanation around what it would mean to present a client ID in this fashion without a scheme as a default. But this similarity sometimes is a URI, isn't a URI ID, and the scheming, the use of the colon, it all feels really, I don't have the right word for it, but there's room for a lot of confusion. And
the I think that they are all actually URIs, though, with the exception of redirect URI scheme. Is that the case? Can Daniel or Joseph chime in on that? But like the did one, dids are URIs, and that's the scheme of the did URI.
I think,
yeah, that's the other special case.
just
I'm
a
pretty sure.
reminder. So the URI is the super term, and the URI can be a URN, which is just a name and not the locator. And then there's the URL, the locator part, which you can then go somewhere and look it up. So that's the distinguishing part. So so it depends what you mean. Like Aaron, I don't know if you intentionally sometimes use URL and then you switch to URI, whether that's just a mistake or whether that's intentional. That's something I haven't figured out yet.
I am not sure of every use of the terms in the document, whether they are consistent.
Over the course of the break, I wasn't paying total attention to all the email, but Taka submitted some questions regarding the scheme, and he was having trouble parsing the various values as URIs because either dashes or underscores, I can't remember which, are not allowed, according to what he said, as part of a URI scheme. So
yeah, and this is why scheme is possibly a misleading name. This client ID value is not meant to be a URI. That's That's the
But
problem. That's the
That's
discussion. So,
exactly. But then we treat it like it is in a bunch of cases.
Yeah.
Where the DID or HTTPS is also a URI, legitimate URI scheme. So I guess I'm arguing for consistency and not kind of using URI schemes in some cases and kind of using whatever this is in other cases. And if we really need to allow for bare HTTPS URIs as the value itself, special case that with some kind of defaulting or something where it's clear that the URI or clear that the prefix is omitted entirely, rather than sort of these weird rules about, or at least what feels to me like weird rules about it sometimes being a URI scheme, sometimes not. Is this prefix a URI scheme prefix? Is it not? And yes, scheme is maybe overloaded and misleading, but it's hard to come up with a term there. But yeah. I'm trying to.
Yeah, I'm trying to follow what's going on in the chat.
Yeah, it's too many.
Can I say something, Aaron?
Yes.
So the spec does say for HTTPS, this client identifier scheme must not be registered. Would it be better perhaps to say that the HTTPS and HTTP, because you can host a client ID metadata document on HTTP for certain purposes, if you are passing those, then it is treated as a bare value for a client ID. I forget what the term is up here. The original client ID, i.e. it's treated as schema-less. But if you were to prefix it with federation : HTTPS whatever, then that would be with a schema. Likewise, for client metadata, we could reserve metadata : HTTPS whatever, and that would be with a scheme. And then as far as without a scheme goes, it would be a matter of determining what your default behavior there is. Is it to error? Is it to use client ID metadata? Is it to use OpenID federation? Whatever, that is up to you. So you're basically reserving those two schemes purely such that they cannot be misinterpreted as actual schemes. But you would get around this if the separator between the scheme and the value was not a colon. If it was a plus sign or some other symbol, then you'd sidestep this issue of the protocol separator, protocol scheme separator being confused with a OpenID, with an OAuth scheme, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the challenge, I think Joseph was on the right track saying that there's like what we would do if we were doing this from clean slate versus what do we do now that there are things out there that do this. And I think the clean slate approach is something like you suggest, where it's not a colon, we don't call it a scheme. It's clear that it's its own syntax, structured syntax for passing these two different strings. And everything would use it everywhere so that there's no ambiguity. So then the question is, what do we do in order to account for the use of these in the wild that is not the sort of perfect clean situation?
Yeah, I think there you would say, okay, well, the HTTPS and HTTP schemes, or types, let's call them types, given
Types.
the confusion over schemes. If you call them, if the HTTPS : prefix and the HTTP : prefix as types cannot be registered, then we just treat that as a bare value, much like if you have a randomized string as a client ID. You know, that could in theory include a colon, because it's a random value. And then you would have a random value as your client ID type. And that wouldn't make any sense either. So if it's HTTPS or HTTP, or it's not one that you know, then you treat it as an opaque value. And that's your fallback path. And you're treating it as an opaque value, so then it's up to the server to do whatever it chooses is the right behavior there. Whether that's to implement a bare client ID metadata document, whether that's to implement a bare OpenID Federation document or URI, whatever that is, and then in the specs themselves for client ID metadata documents and OpenID Federation, we can add in some errata or add in some language that says, if you are implementing a server that implements this spec, we encourage you to also implement the metadata colon prefix detection in your server, such that if it is supplied, then you parse it in this way. If it is not supplied, then you treat it as the bare thing. Does that sort of make sense?
I think so.
That way,
I think
you can have the default behavior, but also give them the upgrade path towards where we want them to get to, which is that world where we actually did this originally.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what we're trying to suggest, basically. We want people to always use the schemes, and does this carve out for you can handle HTTPS specially? I think that's...
Guys, we
yeah,
should really take care or pay attention to the queue. We ignored Dick now for a couple of iterations, so feeling bad about that.
Thanks, Hannes. Can you go back a couple slides, Aaron, to sort of the motivation?
This one?
The one where you had WordPress and Mastodon.
Yeah. You seeing it?
I'm not. I'm seeing. Oh, okay.
Should say applicability.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just wondering whether I think this has been discussed, and I don't remember what the answer is. Maybe just for someone taking minutes on here, we can capture that. Why are we not sidestepping all of this and using a different parameter in the authorization request, such as client_URL, that then makes it clear that the client is saying, I'm not pre-registered, and here's my URL for you to go and get data about me, and use this URL as the identifier?
I think that that doesn't solve the ambiguity question when there's multiple different ways to fetch that URL or different interpretations of the URL, such as the OpenID Federation versus the client metadata document. Plus, it's like no OAuth software out there is going to support that, so it's like a huge amount of breaking changes to libraries and things.
Well, it's a new parameter and it's new functionality, and so you're going to have to add it in anyway.
Yeah, it's just that like there's a lot
of differentiates it between, then the HTTPS is reserved for federation, right? And so if you're a federation, you have client ID be the HTTPS, and if you're wanting to be a discovered non-pre-registered client, you could use client URL.
I mean that you're essentially talking about breaking a bunch of existing software, but yes, it's a solution.
Well, I mean, the server is going to have to operate differently anyway. So,
well, no. So my
is there stuff that's out there that's already using client ID equals
yes,
HTTPS?
Yes, that's my point. Is that like this is a thing that exists. There's several ecosystems and pieces of software that do this already. So the question is, how can we document that as a standard? Again, like I maybe I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but like I feel like we're kind of lost sometimes in these discussions of trying to create from scratch like a perfect clean world, whereas in reality standards should be documenting things that exist, and in order to better standardize them and get them to be able to be implemented without having to read specific documentation. And
well, Aaron, ideally it would be nice to have a sweet spot where we discuss things and then people deploy it. But if we go this approach, someone does something and then we just standardize whatever they did, we have a lot of mess, right? We want
no, and this for sure, and this is part of working in with other communities like OpenID, for example, which went and did the federation thing, and that it's out there, it exists, right? So we can't, should everyone have to like go through the IETF as a gatekeeper before modifying any parts of OAuth? Probably not. That doesn't sound like a great solution either.
Well, one could have maybe fixed it also in the OpenID Foundation when the work on the federation has sort of started and so on. So like I'm not saying.
I mean, this isn't a widely deployed feature, right? There's a few places that are doing it. I don't know. It seems like a fairly easy change to go and use client URL instead of client ID in the request, and in the parsing to go and look for client URL instead of client ID if you're adding in the functionality.
Sure, but that also doesn't solve the underlying ambiguity issue when there's, if we go tell OpenID Federation, okay, now you're going to start passing this as client URL instead of client ID. Fine.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the things that are looking to do discovery, right? I'm not. The federation continues to operate how it is, where it's client ID with HTTPS. If I'm trying to go,
they get to sit on it because they did it first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I don't think that really addresses Hannes'.
I don't think they did do it first. I think Solid OIDC did HTTPS first. I think
you're
right. I might be wrong there.
Well,
but
my point is, I think you should chat with some implementers on there, as opposed to saying, well, that'll break a whole bunch of things, or something where you're trying to define a behavior that for many people would be potentially new, right? I mean, Mastodon already has a different way that doesn't use this at all, that's deployed, right?
Mastodon's is very, very similar to dynamic client registration. It just doesn't use dynamic client registration for some reason.
But it's not this client
ID. It is not this.
But no, it gives you an opaque client ID identifier.
Yeah, I've coded against it. I know how it works.
Yeah,
I support it. Yeah, and WordPress doesn't support anything like this either. So in your examples here, where it could be
there are WordPress plugins that support this.
Well, yeah, so
that doesn't mean.
So basically, for those use cases that already exist, you're treating it as an opaque value, and then doing something with that value. And that's where saying, okay, well, we recommend you include the metadata colon. If you don't, then it will be treated by the authorization server in whatever way the authorization server deems fit, which may be error. We could recommend that in security best practices or something. But you wouldn't be like, if I'm having trouble trying to keep track of a few things. If HTTPS colon and HTTP colon and maybe a few other very well-known protocols that are already registered as URI schemes are reserved in a way that says, hey, these things are treated as an opaque value. They do not indicate the client ID type. They purely just indicate that they are a URI of some sort. Then you sidestep some of those issues of compatibility and such. In the case where you do have just bare HTTPS, and you don't indicate what the client ID type is, then the authorization server chooses whatever it wants to do, which may give undefined behavior. So that gives people an encouragement to upgrade to including the client ID type.
I need to jump in. We managed to consume the entire hour discussing this topic. So, Aaron, question to you: How do you move forward with all the information you got today?
It's a good question. Maybe I can try to document the different proposals to capture those on a slide, and so we can take some notes somewhere, because there's definitely a few different things being discussed here. Other than that,
yeah, that sounds like a really good thing to do.
and I would love to hear Brian's experience with on the issue. But I think once we have, I think if I can document these different proposals, different versions of it, we can discuss this.
Yeah,
Discuss
and
this
add
again
a
with
few
some better
pros
features
and
for
cons to this, and maybe talk to some of the implementers. That would be also good to hear. Cool. Okay.
One minor issue that I can think of with replacing client ID as a query parameter with client underscore URL is that there is also a property which is client underscore URI. And that is a value that exists within OAuth dynamic client registration metadata, which is also the same properties that client ID metadata documents use. And I would have some concern that people might confuse client underscore URL with client underscore URI.
It also then has implications of what do you do with the JOT claims that are defined as client ID. So we kind of get into similar conflicts there. So anyway, I think we need to write this up so we can list out these pros and cons about the different versions.
Yeah, we are not at the end here.
Yeah.
It seems. Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, I have to pull the plug here because we exceeded our hour. So well spent. Thanks for the presentation and leading the discussion, Aaron. And thanks to everyone for this lively debate. And yeah, looking forward to talk to all of you at the next virtual intro meeting.
Thanks.
Bye.
Aaron. I do note that the client ID metadata document draft has actually currently expired. We're going to be fixing that, hopefully.
You're going to resubmit it?
Yeah, it's just we haven't had the time to work on it over the last 6 months.
You can
too much.
You can also refresh it just to prevent it from expiring without making any change at all, if you want.
The issue there is Aaron is the only person that can actually push a new version of it, or not a new version or resubmit it. So I can't do that on this one.
You can actually, but we'll take care of it.
Okay.
It expires in 3 days, so we have.
No, it's already expired. Expired yesterday.
January 9th.
And then we'll see it in the working group track. Okay. Thank you all.
Hi Aaron, can you hear me?